everyone, welcome to CEC online lectures. I am Dr. Amna, your educator. I teach political science at Shama Prasad Mukherjee College for Women, University of Delhi. Dear learners, in the lecture we will be focusing on G7 and G20, looking on various aspects involved that make G7 and G20 as important aspects, as important forums for international diplomacy. Now, before we commence our journey, it is very important to understand what do we mean by intergovernmental organization. An intergovernmental organization is an association or collaboration of several sovereign nation states. One of the advantages offered by intergovernmental organization is that attempts to factor in cooperation, getting together to discuss issues, to present aspects for way forward together. Now, intergovernmental organizations are indeed very important in international relations today. They tell us how governance is very complex, because when nations get together to deliberate on several issues, it tells us that the modalities, the peculiarity of any issue, ranging from trade to energy security to financial stability, there are many stakes involved for nation states to factor in collaboration. Intergovernmental organizations are set up by charters, by treaties, amongst others. Now, very peculiar example of a unorthodox intergovernmental mechanism, as when we compare it to formally established intergovernmental organization through treaties and charters like the United Nations, like NATO, we have today in international arena, in global politics, forums wherein cooperation is factored in through informal groupings and alliances. The G7, G8 also, and G20 are an expression of this informal grouping. When we talk about G7, it is an alliance of world's largest economies wherein they get together, and its history is also replicant and example to the same factor, that how in 1970s, due to oil crisis, the nations got together to deliberate as to what lies ahead for the economic issues, what lies ahead, how to challenge and work on with the economic aspects and crisis coming forward. So therefore, when we look at G7, starting from its establishment owing to the oil crisis of 1973, G7 has indeed come a long way. It was made G8 with the incorporation of Russia. Later, when Russia was removed because of annexation of Crimea, it again became G7. So therefore, G7 has played no doubt an important role. It does not have a headquarter, it does not have any secretariat, yet in spite of its informal nature of existence, G7 has got nations together to deliberate on significant economic issues. One of the most important issues, that is namely looking at initiatives for macroeconomic stability. Now, G7 is no doubt a very novel experiment in terms of diplomacy focused on various informal mechanisms, and with time there has been the need felt to have a much more representative character of G7. Today, nations are pointing out that how important countries like India, South Korea are excluded from G7. Recently, the American President Donald Trump also pointed out that how it is important to highlight that it is essential to have new nations, especially India, to have better representation and to let G7 be a better reflection of world realities. So therefore, time and again these things have been discussed and debated. G7 has indeed come a long way from its earlier summits in 1970s to the recent one in 2019, where France also invited India as a special guest. So therefore, with time, there has been important efforts made by G7, and at the same time there has been important deliberations that are going on right now to increase, to expand the participation and have a much representative aspect for G7. Now, along with G7, another informal association which is indeed playing a very important role in global diplomacy through various informal arrangements is the G20. G20 is an informal association of 19 countries and the European Union. Today, G20 has representations and participation from important international organizations like the International Monetary Fund, the World Bank, amongst others, representing nearly 2/3 of world population and nearly a huge amount of world's GDP. G20 has indeed emerged as a very important forum for international diplomacy, ranging for several economic to other issues. Now, when we look at G20, it is very essential to understand what actually laid the process of its formation. The 1997 to 1999, the Asian financial crisis deliberated an important aspect wherein the finance ministers, the central bank governors of G7 nations got together to deliberate on what could be the next way out, what could be the opportunities and challenges wherein nations need to get together. So therefore, one finds that with 2008 another financial crisis, world leaders get together to have a political consensus to expand opportunities and realms of deliberation concerning world economy, world global diplomacy, amongst others. G20 is an outcome of that, right from its first summit in 2008 in United States, in 2009 in United Kingdom, in 2010 Canada, Toronto, or to the present ones wherein in 2020 it will be hosted in Riyadh, and in 2022 India will be hosting the G20 summit. G20 has indeed come a long way in international diplomacy. When we look at G20 like G7, it is a very important informal or platform for international diplomacy. Unlike a traditional intergovernmental organization, the G22 is also slightly unconventional, unorthodox in its approach, primarily in terms of the fact that it does not have a headquarter or a secretariat, or it does not have any kind of charter or treaty to its backing. Yet G20 has played a very important role in global politics. Now, when we try to understand issues of global politics, we have to see that how governance is becoming really complex. And this is what really brings us to a very important aspect, that how today world organizations from IMF to the World Bank to even regional organizations like NEPAD, like AMC, they have been invited by G20 for various deliberations. So why G20 really matters? Because globalization today, involving interconnectedness, interdependencies, is indeed very complex and global. Why G20 really matters for world politics? Because world global issues are overlapping and interconnected, and at the same time there are attempts to carve out, to understand the challenges and the opportunities that are there with the world's new global order. So therefore, when we try to understand G20, all this presents to us some very interesting insight in terms of its membership, wherein how huge countries have got together, countries with great amount of GDP and great amount of influence on global issues are there together. In terms of its summits also, consistently it has worked to ensure that there is due attendance, due deliberation. The agenda of G20 is always decided annually. This also shows that how it is much more authentic and true to appreciate and understand global realities. Now, when we look at the working of G20, it has a finance track and a Sherpa track. The finance track, wherein there are deliberations by the finance ministers, the central bank governors on significant issues, and the Sherpa track, wherein there are avenues of political cooperation, engagement on trade, development, amongst others. A very important thing for G20 is that the concept of Troika, wherein the past president, the present and the future presidencies work together in collaboration. Now, this is very essential to factor in consistency in terms of work approach. As we understand the working of G7 and G20 as important avenues of international diplomacy, it is very essential to have insights into contemporary developments. We all know that how the United States President Donald Trump also pointed out that it is very essential to make G7 as an authentic platform representing global issues. Similarly, with G20's recent virtual summit, wherein the Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi ji spoke about the very important aspect of having a humanitarian approach to globalization, not just limiting globalization to economic aspects, but also to have a humanitarian perspective on globalization. It is also very important that how in 2019, at the backdrop of G20 Osaka summit, also the Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi ji also spoke about looking at important variables like gender, artificial intelligence, wherein nations can get together, and also to put forward India's agenda at G20. Time and again, there have been pleas to have reform of multilateralism. So therefore, in the present, the contemporary virtual G20 summit, issues like need to have a fiscal injection by all G20 economies in order to safeguard global economy, or to have a coalition, a solidarity, a plan of action to manage the coronavirus pandemic. All of it have been deliberated. So this shows that how important G20, its meetings are there, and the kind of value individual nation states, its member states accord to their domestic issues. When we are trying to understand informal international diplomacy mechanisms like G20, no doubt it offers advantages like that of flexibility, like that of being much more representative of issues of global diplomacy. It has time and again pointed out for the need to reform international financial structures. But at the same time, lack of enforceable commitments, lack of legal bindings are some issues wherein there is hampering of the work of G7 and G20. So therefore, it is very important to look at G7 and at G20 in a holistic perspective. At one point, it offers huge advantages that of flexibility, that of revision of agenda, that of offering benefits of that of an informal arrangement to factor in international diplomacy. There is regular participation and due attendance of their member states in their summits. So these are certain definite advantages offered by them as informal intergovernmental mechanisms. However, one has to take into account that unlike international organizations like the World Trade Organization, where the commitments and agreements are legally binding and enforceable, the meetings, the agenda, the deliberations of G7 and G20 are not legally binding. Nonetheless, one has to focus on that how working of G7 and G20 has offered more avenues of participation and cooperation. Herein, it is very important for us to analyze some of the important books and some further reference reading literature. We present to you a book by Steve Slaughter as to how the author points towards that how G20 has emerged as an important forum in global politics. We all know that theories in international relations are based on assumptions, and this book has worked based on various perspectives in international relations, from the cooperative agenda to the green agenda, depicting how G20 has indeed come a long way. No doubt it is an informal mechanism. Irrespective of its ad hocism has worked in that station of a permanent mechanism in terms of due representation, due participation, due attendance of its member states, and how this, irrespective of this informality, G20 has been very true to the crude realities of international relations. That is, governance is complex, is porous. There are new issues in world politics. Power has many facets, and all of it have been duly deliberated and incorporated in its agenda by G20. Now, when we look at working of G7 also, there are certain very important deliberations in terms of collective management, in terms of American leadership model, in terms of also talking about the idea of a false consensus. So therefore, no doubt there are critiques, there are opportunities, there are advantages, there are disadvantages that are there in the varied layers of G7 and G20. Nonetheless, irrespective of it, G7 and G20 have worked as very important forums for global diplomacy. Time and again it has showed that how intergovernmental cooperation need not be just factored in by formal mechanisms, and this also speaks about the changing global dynamics, that how today state actors coexist with non-state actors. The fact being, today power is multidimensional. Today, global issues range from military threats to non-military, non-traditional threat, where the threat cuts across borders, and there is a need for new agendas of deliberation like trade, energy, international taxation policy. This very important book that talks about G20 and future of economic governance points to us at how today G20, irrespective of all criticism, it has indeed done some great work to address issues of global polity. Then when we talk about solidarity and cooperative arrangements like G7 and G20, the idea of membership or that of is that there are some power mechanisms that are involved in the management of G7 and G20 with respect to their membership. So this is a very important book again that looks into the power dynamics involved in the exclusive clubs, in terms of their membership, in terms of how today there's a need to relook towards the other arrangements of international cooperation. So therefore, intergovernmental cooperation, intergovernmental organizations to factor in avenues of working together with member nation states, sovereign member nation states, have indeed been there in international politics, mostly through charters and treaty, and UN and NATO are prime examples of it. But today, informal association, informal meetings, informal gatherings in the nature of G7 and G20 have indeed shown us that how informal arrangements can offer avenues to deliberate, can offer new scope to manage issues of global politics. There is an issue over membership, over representation, because global politics is changing every hour. Today, dynamics of world issues are indeed very complex, wherein one layer is connected to the other. So looking at all these dynamics, indeed G7 and G20 have played an important role. Criticism prevail, yet a lot is being done in terms of regular participation and attendance, which is indeed unique in terms of factoring in avenues of working together. India indeed has a great role to play in G7 as well as G20. Today, the countries of G7 and G20 look at India to factor in leadership, for guidance in terms of getting better rules for world trade, in terms of working out solutions for better gains to all in terms of trade, energy, development, ecology, amongst others. So therefore, dear learners, when we look at G7 and G20, one has to look at how mechanisms of cooperation in global politics have ranged from formal to informal. Today, because of peculiarities of global politics, informal mechanisms have indeed proved advantageous. Challenges definitely remain. Nonetheless, nations of the world are united to make better use of these summits, of these gatherings, to factor in national interest through better management, through better interface with their foreign affairs. This also speaks about a crude dynamic of world politics now, that the global is connected to the domestic and the domestic has a linkage with the global. Thank you, learners, for being with us for this lecture. We hope in this lecture you gained some significant insights into working of G7 and G20.